To continue, as I said before, America was the threshold from where studies in comparative administration were set up. Now, a body or a committee called the CAG meaning the Comparative Administrative Group. It was set up by American thinkers and administrators in about 1960. Yes, in 1960 the CAG was set up, and this committee or group began to analyze the study of and the working of administrative institutions all over the world. Now, this committee was chaired by another important scholar. I don't know whether you have heard of him, one Frederick Riggs. Now, he has written a book on the ecology of public administration. Now, the funding for the study came from the Ford Foundation, and the Ford Foundation spent lavish money on studying or in carrying out a comparative study. This scholar, Frederick Riggs, the chairman of that CAG group, now began to make a full-fledged analysis of administrative systems in the third world countries. Then we find from there onwards, America took the lead in giving aid to those countries that had been shattered in the Second World War. All of you might have heard of the famous Marshall Plan, whereby America gave liberally for the rebuilding of Europe, and this stage passes and we come to the stage of the Cold War. The Cold War was an aftermath of the Second World War. The two blocs, the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc, had their different ideologies, and this clash of ideological warfare also had its impact on the third world countries. Now, what happened there? Now, these newly independent states could either, they had the option either to join with the communist socialist bloc under Russia, or you can find they could go with America and copy the West. Now, that choice was there with them, and this enriched comparative public administration, because we find that by this kind of dialogue between the East and the West, in spite of the Cold War, much attention as well as greater development was there in comparative public administration. Now, this comparative administrative group was later on disbanded. That was in the 1970s and 80s. Now, in place of this comparative administrative group, we find that several scholars independently began to make comparative studies between their own systems and other developing systems. Now, here we find that there is a growing literature on the administrative systems of the third world countries. For example, we find that there has been a book written by Gabriel Almond. Gabriel Almond is one of the leaders or leading writers in public administration, along with David Easton, who coined the term political system. Now, these writers began to have a passion, and also it was a fashion to write about the non-West rather than the already developed administrative systems in the West. Now, this book called the administration of developing areas was a distinct landmark in the study of comparative public administration, because from there on we find that it became the fashion to adopt one particular country either in Asia or in Africa and compare them with the Soviet model or the Western democratic model, and also to go into and scrutinize the peculiar features of this developing world. Now that you can say was the acme or the heyday of comparative public administration, because several studies and books came about, some you can say on the spot investigation of the administrative systems of the third world developing countries. Now the word underdeveloped was given up and they were now designated as the developing world along with the developed world. Now democratic institutions began to flourish in most of these newly independent countries. Notably in India, we became a republic, we adopted democratic constitution, and that was the beginning of elected government. Now the distinction is between the elected government and the non-elected government, which we call the nominated government. Now a comparative study of the functioning of democratic institutions in the developing world was very useful, because it was a pointer to the carrying out of administrative reforms. So CPA led to, indirectly or directly, to the elaboration and enunciation of several administrative reforms. Now the aim of these reforms was to make or streamline the administrative systems of the developing world and compare them with the developed systems in the Western and European countries. Now this was the time when we find that comparative public administration reached its zenith or reached its peak, and from there onwards we find that it has been able to add on to and to enrich the already rich literature of public administration. So comparative public administration therefore came into its own. It acquired, you can say, an independent status. So the offshoot of public administration was comparative public administration. The offshoot of comparative public administration was, you can say, what we call today development administration. Now I can better show you this on the board. Public administration, down, second, comparative public administration, third, downwards, development administration. Now these are used interchangeably. They can also be called administrative development. Both of them mean the same thing, because comparison led to a thirst for or a need for development. So this is the way in which CPA contributed to development administration. So now we find that CPA takes a back seat and the front seat is occupied by development administration. But you have to understand that without the first, the second would not come into existence. It was because of the comparison with the developed world that the third world countries wanted to have similar type of institutions in their own countries, and now the scholars began to call it development administration. Now, development administration is a subject on its own and it is worthy of separate explanation. Now, all we can say here is that when comparative public administration came into its own, it had two singular benefits. One is, first of all, it enriched the literature of public administration. Second, theorization in public administration was now mainly held by CPA, Comparative Public Administration. Thirdly, the benefit was that comparative public administration did not stand alone. Upwards, it had its mother, public administration, and downward, it had its offspring, that is development administration. Now, it gave birth to development administration, which could have come into existence only because there was a comparative link that was forged between these developing countries and the developed West. So, where does CPA stand today? Now, CPA is today a study on its own. It has its own theories, its own formulas, and its own definitions, and a wide scope also, because it teaches us that we need not stick to one particular administrative system and study it in exclusion. We can include more and more systems and try to compare and contrast what are the common features and what are the dissimilar features among different political systems. So, this was another huge benefit in the sense that it gave rise to many different distinct type of public administrative systems which could then be able to stand on their own. So, CPA is today something that has given us a legacy which is now carried down by development administration or administrative development, which again gave rise to, you can say, the individual study of the working and functioning of development administration in different countries, and the further literature was added on to what is called public administration. That is the main mark and the main contribution that CPA has given to our major subject, public administration.